When my grandpa chuckled at dinner and said, "Your dad told me you record those sweet messages for me," I had no idea that my confused response would unravel the most heartbreaking deception in my family, one that revealed just how desperately lonely my grandfather had become and how far my father would go to ease that pain. Before I take you into this story that changed how I see love, guilt, and family forever, I'd love to know what generation you're from. Drop your age in the comments below, give this video a like, and if you're new here, subscribe to hear more stories about family secrets that come from the deepest places of love. Now, let me bring you back to that Thursday evening when everything I thought I knew about my family shifted. My name is Emma, I'm 19 years old, and I'm a sophomore at Northwestern University. Like most college students, I'm constantly busy, juggling classes, work-study jobs, social life, and the general chaos of figuring out who I'm supposed to become. My family has always been close, but since starting college, I'll be honest, I don't call home as much as I should, and I definitely don't reach out to my 82-year-old grandfather as often as I know I ought to. It was the first Thursday of October, and I was home for a long weekend, one of those rare breaks where I didn't have papers due or exams looming. Mom had insisted on a family dinner, the kind we used to have every week before life got complicated. She'd made her famous lasagna, Dad had picked up garlic bread from the Italian place downtown, and my 16-year-old brother Tyler had actually put his phone away without being asked 3 times. But the real guest of honor was Grandpa Henry. Since Grandma Ruth passed away 8 months ago, these family dinners had become more frequent and more important. Dad had been picking him up every Thursday, determined to make sure he wasn't spending too many evenings alone in the house where he'd lived with Grandma for 47 years. Grandpa looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but somehow diminished, like grief had taken up residence in his shoulders and was weighing him down. His eyes still sparkled when he saw me, though, and he pulled me into one of his signature bear hugs that smelled like aftershave and peppermint candy. "There's my college girl," he said, holding me at arm's length to get a good look. "Getting more beautiful every time I see you, and so smart. Your voice notes always brighten my whole week." I smiled and hugged him again, but something felt off. Voice notes? I mean, I'd sent him maybe 2 or 3 text messages since school started, and definitely no voice messages. I'm barely comfortable leaving voicemails for official things, let alone recording casual messages for family. We settled around the dining room table, the same one where I'd done homework as a kid, and where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday. Mom had brought out the good dishes, another sign that she was trying to make these evenings special for Grandpa. The conversation flowed easily at first. Tyler talked about his soccer season. Mom updated us on her book club drama, and Dad complained about his boss with the same enthusiasm he'd had for years. I shared stories about my psychology classes and my roommate's latest dating disasters. Then Grandpa turned to me with that warm, grandfatherly smile that always made me feel like the most important person in the room. "Emma, sweetie, I have to tell you, those voice messages you send me are just wonderful. Yesterday's was especially touching when you talked about missing Grandma's apple pie and how you could smell it in your dorm room just thinking about it." The fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I looked across the table at Dad, who had suddenly become very interested in his lasagna. Mom's smile faltered just slightly. "Grandpa?" I said slowly. I'm not sure what you mean." "What voice messages?" His face lit up even more. "Oh, don't be modest. The ones you record for me every few days. Your dad plays them for me on his phone when he comes to visit. They're the highlight of my week, sweetheart. Hearing your voice talking about school, about memories with Grandma, about how much you love me, it means everything to an old man." The dining room suddenly felt very quiet. Tyler looked confused, glancing between me and Dad. Mom had stopped eating entirely and was staring at her plate. Dad's face had gone pale. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grandpa, I haven't sent you any voice messages. I didn't even know you had a phone." The silence that followed was deafening. Grandpa's smile slowly faded as he looked around the table, taking in everyone's expressions. Dad's water glass slipped from his hand, sending ice and liquid spilling across the white tablecloth. "Michael?" Grandpa's voice had changed, becoming smaller, more uncertain. "What is Emma talking about?" Dad looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Mom reached over and put her hand on his arm, but he pulled away. Dad started, then stopped. "I can explain." And in that moment, sitting at our family dinner table with garlic bread growing cold and my grandfather's confused eyes searching all our faces, I finally understood. The voice messages weren't from me at all. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of awkward conversation and meaningful glances. Grandpa seemed confused and hurt, though he tried to hide it behind his usual jovial demeanor. Dad barely spoke, pushing his food around his plate like a guilty child. Tyler kept looking between all of us like he was watching a tennis match he didn't understand. After we finished eating, and Mom had bustled Grandpa into the living room with promises of coffee and his favorite cookies, I cornered Dad in the kitchen while he was scraping plates. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" He set down the plate he was holding and leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older than his 48 years. "Emma, this is complicated." "Complicated? Dad, Grandpa thinks I've been sending him voice messages." He quoted specific things I supposedly said. "What is happening?" Dad was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard where Tyler was throwing a ball for our dog, Buster. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I've been making them. The voice messages. I've been recording them and telling Dad they're from you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You've been..." "What?" "Emma, you have to understand. After Mom died, Dad was so lost, so lonely. He would sit in that house for days without talking to another soul. When you went back to school after the funeral, he asked me constantly when you were going to call, when you were coming home, whether you were thinking about Grandma." I felt sick. "So you decided to impersonate me." "Not impersonate. I would never try to sound like you. I would tell him that you'd sent me voice messages to pass along to him. Then I'd relay things I thought you might say. Sweet things. Memories. How much you love him." The kitchen felt like it was spinning. "Dad, that's insane. How long has this been going on?" "Since about a month after the funeral. So 7 months." 7 months. Nearly my entire sophomore year, my grandfather had been receiving fake messages, supposedly from me, and I'd had no idea. "What did you say in them? What did you tell him I said?" Dad's eyes filled with tears. "Things I knew you would say if you called more often. That you missed him. That you were thinking about family recipes Grandma taught you. That you were sorry you couldn't visit more, but that you carried him and Grandma in your heart wherever you went." Each revelation felt like another punch to the gut. These weren't random lies. They were things I actually felt, but had never expressed. Dad had somehow channeled my genuine emotions and fed them to Grandpa in my voice, creating a version of me that was more communicative and present than I actually was. "Did Mom know?" Dad nodded miserably. "She begged me to stop, said it wasn't fair to you or to Dad. But Emma, you should have seen how happy it made him. For the first time since Mom died, he had something to look forward to. He would ask me to play them over and over." From the living room, I could hear Grandpa's laugh at something Tyler had said, but it sounded forced now, hollow. The man who had seemed so genuinely happy about my messages was now sitting in our living room, probably wondering if anything he believed about his granddaughter's love for him was real. "I have to tell him the truth," I said. "Emma, please, think about what that would do to him. He's already lost Grandma. If he finds out that his granddaughter hasn't actually been thinking about him, that the messages that have been keeping him going are all fake." "But they're not fake." The words exploded out of me. "The feelings aren't fake. I do miss him. I do think about Grandma's recipes. I do love him desperately. I'm a terrible granddaughter who never calls." Dad reached for my hand. "You're not terrible. You're a college student living your life. But Dad is 82 and alone for the first time in almost 50 years. He needed to hear those things, even if they were lies." We stood in the kitchen, both of us crying now, while the sound of forced normalcy drifted in from the living room. That night, after we'd taken Grandpa home and the house had settled into its usual evening quiet, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 7 months of fake messages, about my grandfather's face when he'd talked about how much they meant to him, about the elaborate deception my father had constructed out of love and desperation. At around midnight, I crept downstairs and found Dad sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and his phone beside him. The glow from the screen illuminated his tired face. "Can't sleep either?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. He shook his head. "I keep thinking about the look on his face when you said you hadn't sent anything. I've never seen him look so confused and hurt. Dad, can I hear one?" One of the messages you told him were from me? Dad hesitated, then picked up his phone. I don't record them, Emma. I call him and tell him I have a message from you. Then I relay it verbally. I pretend I'm reading from my phone or playing something you sent. Show me what you say. Dad's hands shook slightly as he scrolled through what looked like notes on his phone. I write them down first, to make sure I get it right, to make sure it sounds like something you would actually say. He turned the screen toward me, and I read his careful handwriting. Emma wanted me to tell you that she was walking across campus yesterday and saw an elderly man feeding pigeons, and it reminded her of how you and Grandma used to take her to feed the ducks at Miller's Pond. She said she could almost hear Grandma laughing at how the ducks would chase you when you ran out of bread. She wanted you to know that those are some of her happiest childhood memories. My throat tightened. We had fed ducks at Miller's Pond countless times when I was little, and Grandma did always laugh when the ducks got aggressive about the bread. It was a perfect memory, one that I actually did think about sometimes, but had never shared. And this one, Dad continued, swiping to another note, this was from last week. Mom, Emma called to say she was having a hard day with midterms, but then she remembered something Grandma used to tell her. Smart girls don't worry about being perfect, they worry about being kind. She said that got her through her psychology exam, and she wanted to thank you for raising such a wise woman. Tears were streaming down my face now. Dad, these are things I would say. These are real feelings I have. I know you, Emma. I know how much you love him, how much Grandma meant to you. I gave voice to things I knew you carried in your heart, but didn't always express. But why didn't you just encourage me to call him myself? Why create this whole elaborate lie? Dad was quiet for a long moment. Because I was scared that if I kept pushing you to call more, you'd feel guilty and obligated, and then your conversations would feel forced. I wanted him to believe that you were reaching out because you wanted to, because you missed him, not because your dad was nagging you to call your grandfather. The twisted logic of it was almost beautiful in its complexity. Dad had created a version of me that was everything I wanted to be as a granddaughter, but wasn't quite managing to be in real life. Also, Dad continued, his voice getting smaller, I was dealing with my own guilt. Mom's death hit me harder than I expected, and I realized I hadn't been as present as I should have been in her last years. I was so busy with work, with my own life. When I saw Dad struggling with the loneliness, I couldn't bear the thought that he might feel forgotten by the people he loved most. So you made sure he felt remembered. I made sure he felt loved, even if the method was problematic. We sat in the quiet kitchen, both of us processing the weight of what had been revealed. Outside, a car drove by, its headlights briefly illuminating the walls before disappearing into the night. Dad, there's something else I need to know. Did you ever say anything that wasn't true? Anything that I wouldn't actually feel or think? Dad shook his head immediately. Never. I was very careful about that. Everything I told him came from observations about who you are, memories I knew you cherished, values I knew you held. I never invented feelings you didn't have. Somehow, that made it both better and worse. Better because it meant Grandpa's understanding of my love for him wasn't entirely fabricated. Worse because it highlighted just how much I'd been failing to communicate those real feelings myself. The next morning, Dad and I drove to Grandpa's house together. The same small brick ranch where he'd lived with Grandma, where I'd spent countless afternoons learning to bake cookies and listening to stories about the old days. Now it felt different, too quiet, too empty, like a stage set after the play has ended. Grandpa answered the door in his bathrobe and slippers, something that would have been unthinkable when Grandma was alive. She would have had him dressed and presentable by 7 a.m. sharp. His hair was uncombed, and he looked like he'd slept poorly. Michael, Emma, he said, stepping aside to let us in. This is unexpected. Is everything all right? The living room was exactly as Grandma had left it. Doilies on the side tables, family photos covering every surface, her reading glasses still sitting on the arm of her favorite chair. But there were signs of Grandpa's solitary life, too. A TV dinner tray beside his recliner, newspapers stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, a pill organizer that looked like it hadn't been refilled in days. Dad, my father said, settling onto the couch that Grandma had reupholstered 3 times in 30 years. We need to talk about last night, about the voice messages. Grandpa lowered himself into his recliner, the same chair where he'd watched baseball games and evening news for decades. I've been thinking about that all night. I'm not sure I understand what happened. I took a deep breath. Grandpa, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear. I never sent you any voice messages. Not one. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A light going out, a door closing. I see, he said quietly. Dad leaned forward. Dad, let me explain. The messages were real, in a sense. Emma does feel all those things I told you, she said. She does miss you. She does think about Grandma. She does love you desperately. I was the messenger instead of her. You made them up. I translated them. Emma is busy with school, and I know how much she cares about you, so I shared what I knew she would want you to hear. Grandpa was quiet for a long time, staring at a framed photo of him and Grandma on their wedding day. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sad. Michael, do you think I'm a foolish old man? What? No, Dad, of course not. Do you think I can't tell the difference between a granddaughter who calls because she wants to and a son who feels sorry for his lonely father? The question hung in the air like smoke. Dad's face crumpled. Dad, it wasn't about pity. It was about love. I saw how happy the messages made you, and you saw a pathetic old man who needed to be lied to in order to feel loved. That's not true. But I realized that from Grandpa's perspective, that's exactly what it looked like. My father, however well-intentioned, had decided that the truth of our relationship, that I was a busy college student who loved him but didn't call often, wasn't good enough, that Grandpa needed a fantasy version of a devoted granddaughter to be happy. Grandpa, I said, my voice shaking. The feelings were real. Everything Dad told you I said, those are things I actually think and feel. I'm really bad at expressing them. He looked at me with those kind eyes that had watched me grow up, that had seen me through scraped knees and high school heartbreaks and college acceptances. Emma, sweetheart, you don't owe me anything. You're 19 years old. You should be focused on school and friends and figuring out your life, not worrying about your grandfather's loneliness. But I do worry about it. I think about you all the time. I just get overwhelmed and don't know what to say, so I don't call, and then I feel guilty, so it gets harder to call, and it becomes this whole cycle. Dad was crying now, watching the conversation between his father and daughter that he'd tried to facilitate through deception. I ruined everything, he whispered. I was trying to help, and I made everything worse. Grandpa reached over and took Dad's hand. You didn't ruin anything, son. You saw your old man struggling and tried to help. It came from a good place, even if the method was misguided. Then he turned to me. Emma, would you like to know what made those messages special? It wasn't the specific words. It was the idea that you were thinking about me, that I crossed your mind during your busy days. Whether you actually said those things or your father imagined them doesn't change the fact that they came from real love. What followed was the most honest conversation our family had ever had. We talked about grief, about expectations, about the different ways people show and need love. Grandpa admitted that he'd been struggling more than he'd let on since Grandma died, not just with loneliness, but with feeling disconnected from a world that seemed to be moving faster than he could keep up with. Dad confessed that his deception had started small, just embellishing a text I'd actually sent, but had grown into something much more elaborate as he saw how much joy it brought Grandpa. What had begun as a one-time kindness had become a web of lies that he didn't know how to escape, and I had to face some uncomfortable truths about myself. I was so caught up in my own life, so overwhelmed by the demands of school and social pressure and figuring out who I was supposed to become, that I'd let one of the most important relationships in my life drift into something shallow and infrequent. I want to do better, I told Grandpa that morning. I want to actually be the granddaughter you deserve, not just the one Dad imagined. You already are that granddaughter, he said. But if you want to call more often, I'd certainly enjoy that. We decided to start with something manageable, a phone call every Sunday evening. Not because Dad was pushing me or because of guilt, but because I genuinely wanted to be more connected to this man who had been such an important part of my life. The first few calls were awkward. We were both hyper-aware that this was real communication, not the filtered, idealized version Dad had been providing. But gradually, we found our rhythm. I told him about my classes, my friends, my worries about the future. He shared stories about Grandma that I'd never heard, memories from his own college days, his thoughts about getting older. What surprised me was how much I enjoyed those conversations. Without the pressure of Dad's mediation or the weight of fabricated perfection, Grandpa and I discovered that we actually had a lot to talk about. He was funnier than I'd remembered, more insightful, more interested in my generation than I'd given him credit for. Dad continued his weekly visits, but they became more genuine too. Instead of managing Grandpa's loneliness through deception, he focused on actually spending quality time with him. They started doing projects together, organizing old photos, maintaining Grandma's garden, even learning to cook some of her recipes. The incident also changed how our whole family approached communication. Mom started calling Grandpa on her own, not just participating in Dad's visits. Tyler began including him in his social media posts and even taught him how to use FaceTime so he could see us more often. 6 months later, at Grandpa's 83rd birthday party, he pulled me aside. "Emma, I want you to know that I'm grateful for what happened, not for the deception itself, but for what it led to. I have a real relationship with you now, and that's worth more than 1,000 fake voice messages. I'm grateful too, Grandpa. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to realize how much I was missing. We're all just doing our best, sweetheart. Your father saw someone he loved in pain and tried to fix it. You were living your life and growing up. I was grieving and lonely. None of us were wrong. We just needed to find a better way to connect. Looking back now, I can see that Dad's deception was both wrong and understandable. It came from a place of deep love and a desire to ease suffering, but it also revealed assumptions about what Grandpa needed and what I was capable of providing. The real tragedy wasn't the lies themselves, but the fact that all three of us, Dad, Grandpa, and I, had underestimated what our relationship could be if we just communicated honestly. Today, Grandpa and I talk every Sunday without fail. Sometimes our conversations are deep and meaningful. Sometimes they're just quick check-ins about the weather and what we had for dinner. Both kinds are valuable. He's become one of my closest confidants, someone I turn to for advice about everything from career decisions to relationship problems. Dad learned a hard lesson about the difference between helping and controlling, between love and manipulation. His intentions were pure, but the execution highlighted how easy it is to decide for other people what they need instead of asking them directly. And I learned that maintaining relationships requires intentional effort, that love isn't just a feeling but a practice, and that the people who matter most to us deserve our genuine presence, not just our guilty promises to do better. The voice messages Dad created were beautiful in their way, full of love and care and deep understanding of who I am at my core. But the real conversations Grandpa and I have now are even more beautiful because they're ours, built on truth and sustained by mutual effort and genuine affection. If you're struggling to stay connected with older family members, or if you've ever found yourself caught between love and deception in trying to help someone you care about, know that the truth, even when it's messy and imperfect, usually creates stronger foundations than the most well-intentioned lies. Thanks for listening to this story about love, lies, and the complicated ways families try to take care of each other. If this resonated with you or reminded you to call someone you've been meaning to reach out to, let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story made you think differently about family communication, and subscribe to hear more real stories about the unexpected ways we learn to love each other better. Sometimes the most beautiful relationships are the ones we almost let slip away.